Hey, thank you for joining me for today's video. Today we're taking a look at another legal topic relevant to online businesses, specifically the California Consumer Privacy Act effective date. So I'm Richard Chapo. I'm attorney in San Diego, California. I've been advising online businesses for about, the past 20 plus years. So the California Consumer Privacy Act effective date might seem like an odd subject for a video, and normally it would be, except that with this law, we got some strange situations because, well, California. So to understand what we're dealing with here, we kind of have to step back a little bit and realize that the CCPA was actually originally an initiative. So in California, we have an initiative system where voters can effectively just skip the legislature and the government and vote on laws directly during elections. And so what happens is you create an initiative that you're interested in, and you go out and you harass people at various malls and stores and get them to sign petitions saying they're interested in the initiative. And if you get enough signatures, it goes on the ballot. And then if enough Californians vote for it, well, it passes and becomes law. And if it sounds like we might get some strange laws from that, we do. But in this case, it was pretty obvious that this initiative was going to pass, but it had a lot of problems with it. It was going to conflict with federal law, and even California had some other laws it was going to be problematic with. And so through some political wrangling in the summer of 2018, the California political apparatus basically convinced the backers of the initiative to take it off the ballot, and they went ahead and just essentially turned it into a law called the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was changed a little bit to try to deal with some of the problems, but more or less the same general concept. And that's what we see today. There have been some amendments. They're trying to address some other problems with it, but it's a flawed law. It was put together in 7 days, and now we're kind of trying to deal with it. And so one of those flaws is leading to the problem with the effective date. So the stated effective date for the California Consumer Privacy Act is January 1st, 2020, except when it's not. So the Attorney General's office in California is charged with enforcing the act. And the AG essentially has said, we need more time. And the political apparatus has agreed. And the reason they need more time is the AG must issue rules and regulations regarding how the act will be interpreted on a practical level, what's really actually expected of businesses, what's considered compliance and what is not. And this process involves holding hearings, and then there'll be a draft of the rules and regulations, and then there'll be more hearings and comment period, and so on and so forth. And so what we're seeing is that it's expected that the AG will not issue the final regulations until the summer of 2020, 6 months after the effective date written into the act. And if it's not issuing rules and regulations till then, well, enforcement actions are probably not going to be happening till then either. And so summer 2020 is kind of the period most people are looking at now. However, before you get too excited about that, it's important to realize that there is actually something called a private right of action under the law. And what that means is that individuals can actually bring lawsuits under the law. And obviously, they don't need regulations to do that. Now, these lawsuits can only be brought in relation to data breaches. So a company is hacked, personal information is stolen, a person who's had their information stolen can bring the lawsuit. And individual lawsuits really aren't that big of a concern, but there's a right of class action, and that's where the big dollars start happening, and you really want to avoid those. Now, based on the way the law is drafted, those can move forward on January 1st, 2020. So if you suffer a data breach on January 2nd, 2020, the fact the AG has not issued regulations is probably not going to help you. There is a potential defense in that area that involves technical legal issues, but not one that I would rely on. So again, we're kind of back to January 1st, 2020. Now, there's a third aspect of this that not a lot of people are talking about, and that will get more attention as we move forward. And that's what I refer to as no date. When California passes a law of this type that's very sweeping and very, a new approach, if you will, to a certain subject, a lot of other states will soon follow and try to do the same thing. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing tons of states issuing their own consumer privacy acts, and they all have different rules and regulations, and it creates this massive burden for businesses. And so what typically happens in a situation like this is businesses in that particular niche will lobby Congress at the federal level, the federal government, to enact or to pass legislation on a national law on whatever the topic is. And so we're seeing that in this case. We're seeing Google and Facebook and private privacy groups. Everybody pretty much across the spectrum is looking at Congress and saying, hey, we need an effective national law. And the advantage of the national law is that will essentially trump the state laws. So where you have a state law and a national law on the same subject, the national law essentially is the effective law, and the state law more or less becomes void. Now, there can be some exceptions around the borders of those laws, but that's generally how it works. So the idea here is that we get a national law on privacy, consumer privacy. Everybody knows what the requirements are. Everybody complies. You only have one set of rules you have to deal with instead of 50. And, that's a much more workable solution. Now, the question is, when would we see this National Privacy Act? Well, there are two primary problems that I see. One is, as you probably noticed, the political climate in Washington, D.C., not great. So getting them to enact any law of this sort might be difficult. The second problem is, I think everybody agrees that we need a National Privacy Act. I don't think anybody really disagrees with that, but the problem is what goes into that act. There are going to be some groups that want to see a monster, vicious law like the GDPR in Europe, and others who are going to want to see something that's basically pretty simple and not particularly burdensome to deal with. So can we get enough of these groups together that they can actually create language that will get passed? We have a Democrat-controlled House and we have a Republican-controlled Senate. Well, your guess is as good as mine. Hopefully it happens. And when would it happen? 2019? That would be great, because then we really wouldn't have to worry about the California Consumer Privacy Act. But realistically, probably 2020, maybe later, if it gets done at all. So unfortunately, I think at this point you need to comply with the California Consumer Privacy Act. If you meet the requirements and you have to comply, well, you need to get moving on it. And the good news is, if you do take these steps, if a subsequent national law is enacted, you're probably going to, be a good way towards complying with that as well, if not completely. It may well be that the national law is less burdensome than the California law. And so it's not a situation where I think you'd necessarily be wasting a lot of money, taking these steps. So what is the California Consumer Privacy Act effective date? Well, the stated date in the legislation itself is January 1st, 2020. For government enforcement actions, it's probably more like summer of 2020. For private right of actions brought by consumers for data breaches, for hacks, if you will, well, it's probably looking more like January 1st, 2020. And of course, all of this may get trumped by a federal national privacy law. So not the bright line answer that you probably were hoping for, but that's kind of where we are. So anyways, if you have questions or comments, post them below. I'll be happy to try to answer them. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving us a thumbs up. If you're interested in online topics, or topics related to running an online business from a legal perspective, consider subscribing to our channel, as we'll be posting all kinds of videos on those topics. So anyways, thanks for watching. Have yourself a good one.